Imagine a crisis so absolutely massive, so perfectly hidden in plain sight, that it's almost impossible to visualize. We're not talking about millions or billions or even a few trillion. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving deep into the invisible, incredibly high-stakes architecture of global finance. We're going to step into the shadows of obscure legal documents and quiet boardrooms, where the stability of entire nations literally hangs in the balance.
$348 trillion. By the end of 2025, total global debt reportedly breached this staggering, completely incomprehensible number. To put that anomaly into perspective for you, that represents over 235% of the entire world's economic output. But look, the real story here isn't just that governments owe a lot of money. The deeper, much more dangerous mystery is what happens when nations can no longer borrow cheaply, and when the obscure legal contracts governing that debt leave governments with fewer and fewer choices.
And the immediate danger? It lies in what we call the refinancing cliff. By 2026, emerging markets are projected to face over $9 trillion in refinancing needs. Meanwhile, developed markets face a colossal $20 trillion in maturing bonds and loans. You see, refinancing essentially means a country must roll old debt into new debt. It creates this relentless ticking clock. A country's economic stability relies entirely on maintaining access to financial markets. So if lenders suddenly demand higher rates or just refuse to lend altogether, the whole system can become unstable very, very quickly.
Section 1. Inside the interest machine. The cost of servicing debt.
Let's use the United States as a chilling prime example of this interest burden. Debt becomes especially dangerous when the cost of servicing it grows faster than the economy itself. Look at this trend. We can see net interest outlays rising from roughly $375 billion in fiscal year 2019 all the way to around $971 billion in 2025. And by 2036, projections suggest interest alone could hit $2.1 trillion. That could allegedly consume around 30% of all government revenue. That's money being directly siphoned away from things like schools, hospitals, and infrastructure just to pay for obligations created years and years ago.
This relentless feedback loop is known as the crowding out effect. Here's how it works. More debt leads to higher borrowing costs, which then creates larger interest payments. This leaves less fiscal space in the national budget, forcing, well, exactly, even more borrowing. It is absolutely crucial to realize that a sovereign debt crisis doesn't always start with a formal default announcement. No, it starts right here, as a nation's economic freedom steadily, quietly shrinks.
Section 2. The contractual maze. Navigating debt law.
Okay, decode this vital piece of legalese with me. Pari passu. It's Latin for on equal footing. Now, in theory, this ancient phrase simply requires creditors in the exact same class to be treated equally. Seems fair, right? But as we'll see, the interpretation of this single clause in a New York courtroom completely transformed the global architecture of sovereign debt restructuring. It essentially turned standard negotiations into high-stakes legal warfare.
Section 3. 4 countries, 4 warnings. Real-world debt crises.
Let's act as geopolitical detectives for a second and consider two extreme, very divergent outcomes. After their 2001 default, hedge funds heavily targeted Argentina. They used that exact Pari Passu clause in litigation to demand full repayment. This practically forced Argentina into what was described as a technical default in 2014, even though they actually had the funds to pay their restructured bondholders. Now contrast this with Greece. Greece controversially leveraged the fact that its bonds were issued under domestic law. They retroactively rewrote their own rules to force a restructuring and achieved roughly 97% participation. Sure, it worked, but coercive moves like this can severely damage future investor trust.
So to prevent that Argentine holdout scenario from happening all over again, the market leaned into a contractual patch known as collective action clauses, or CACs. These clauses basically allow a qualified majority, often around 75% of creditors, to legally bind a minority to a restructuring deal. Now, we should note that while they do help prevent a tiny minority from holding an entire nation hostage, they can't magically fix the underlying economic rot, things like weak fiscal policy or currency depreciation. A patch helps repair one leak for sure, but it doesn't fix the entire structure.
Let's unpack Zambia for a moment. In 2022, Zambia secured a $1.3 billion IMF extended credit facility. But this rescue came with strict conditions, including deficit reduction and subsidy reform. Furthermore, their restructuring included state contingent debt linked directly to copper price performance. Now, while this kind of structure shares risk, it massively complicated the math. The result? a remarkably prolonged, sluggish negotiation under the G20 Common Framework just to restructure $6.3 billion of debt. It really shows how the gears of coordinated international rescue turn incredibly slowly.
Now, you might have heard the popular debt trap diplomacy narrative, which often claims deliberate sabotage. But the hard data tells a somewhat different story. At the time of their default, commercial debt made up 42% of Sri Lanka's external debt, while Chinese loans represented only about 13%. Researchers have actively challenged the idea of a systematic trapping strategy here. Objectively speaking, Sri Lanka's crisis wasn't some single villain's grand conspiracy. It was a systemic failure involving commercial borrowing, huge economic shocks, and domestic policy decisions.
Section 4. The fallout in the IMF. What happens after a default?
Following a default, the immediate economic pain is severe. Output reportedly declines by about 3.1% in the first year alone, and inflation? That can spike by around 7.7% by year 5. Trade finance costs surge and foreign direct investment virtually dries up, and when these nations turn to the IMF for conditional rescue, it always sparks a fierce debate. On one side, supporters argue that strict conditionality is absolutely necessary to fix the root causes of the crisis. Critics, however, argue that these exact same austerity measures can impose immediate hardship, reduce access to essential goods, and even incite massive political unrest. The damage easily bleeds straight from government balance sheets directly into the wider economy.
Section 5. Avoiding the debt trap. Reforming the system.
So how do we actually fix this before the next big crisis hits? Well, the path forward relies on cautious, technical reform solutions designed to balance the scales. First, we need greater global debt transparency so everyone understands the true scale of a country's obligations. We also need to actively reconcile claims on collateralized loans and encourage voluntary liability management operations to help countries extend their maturities. Plus, we can implement contractual updates like forfeiture and most favored creditor clauses. Look, the diplomatic goal here isn't to eliminate creditors' rights, nor is it to excuse irresponsible government borrowing. The goal is to create a coordinated, rational system where debt can be resolved fairly before it becomes a permanent mechanism of dependency.
And all of this brings us to a rather chilling conclusion to ponder. Debt is not only about what a country owes, it is about what a country can still choose. This architecture is fragile, the clock is ticking, and the real question remains, when the next sovereign domino falls, will the global system actually hold? Thank you for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you next time.